In this episode, we're going to connect the daily reality of controls to the people who have to make choices about risk, funding, priorities, and accountability. Controls can be well designed and even well implemented, but if nobody can see whether they are working over time, leaders end up making decisions based on comfort, noise, or whatever happened most recently. Monitoring control effectiveness means paying attention to whether controls still produce the outcomes they were chosen for, especially as systems, teams, and threats change. Reporting control effectiveness and coverage means translating what you observe into information that decision-makers can use without needing to become technical specialists. Beginners sometimes assume reporting is just a status update, but good reporting is a form of decision support because it shows what is stable, what is drifting, and where action is required. By the end, you should understand how monitoring and reporting work together to keep control portfolios credible and continuously improving. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to start is to remember that control effectiveness is not a permanent label you assign once and then keep forever. Controls are living parts of an organization's behavior, and behavior changes when people are busy, when priorities shift, and when environments are upgraded or restructured. A control that worked well last quarter can degrade slowly because ownership changes, because exception habits grow, or because inputs become less reliable. Monitoring exists to catch that drift early, while the cost of correction is still manageable. It also exists to identify positive changes, because improving effectiveness should be visible so teams can sustain what is working instead of constantly reinventing it. When monitoring is designed well, it reduces surprises and prevents the organization from discovering control failure only after an incident makes the failure obvious. That is why monitoring is a risk activity as much as a measurement activity. Control coverage is closely related, but it answers a slightly different question than effectiveness, and beginners should keep that distinction clear. Effectiveness asks whether a control achieves its objective where it exists, while coverage asks whether the control applies across the right scope of assets, processes, or dependencies. A control can be effective for a small subset of systems, yet still leave the organization exposed if many critical systems are outside the control's reach. Coverage problems often hide in places where processes are inconsistent, where inventory is incomplete, or where teams have found informal workarounds. Monitoring coverage, therefore, includes checking which assets are included, which are excluded, and whether the reasons for exclusion are deliberate and acceptable. If coverage gaps appear, they must be visible to decision-makers, because filling a gap is often a portfolio choice that involves prioritization and resources. Coverage is a map of protection, not a claim of protection. Monitoring should be anchored in control objectives, because objectives tell you what outcomes you are looking for and what evidence will actually matter. If the objective is to reduce unauthorized access, then monitoring should focus on whether access remains properly limited over time and whether misuse is detected quickly enough to contain. If the objective is to reduce downtime impact, then monitoring should focus on recoverability performance, not only on whether plans exist. If the objective is to reduce harmful change, then monitoring should focus on whether changes follow the intended discipline and whether exceptions are controlled rather than casual. Beginners sometimes track what is easy to track, like whether a document exists, but objective-based monitoring tracks what proves the control is doing its job. This approach also makes reporting clearer, because you can explain results as outcomes achieved or outcomes at risk, rather than as lists of activities completed. Monitoring becomes meaningful when it is tied to the original reason the control was chosen. A major source of confusion is the difference between monitoring activity and monitoring effectiveness, and decision-makers care far more about the second than the first. Activity is something that happens, like a review being performed or a checklist being filled out, while effectiveness is the result that activity produces, like reduced exposure or faster detection. An organization can be very busy and still be unsafe, especially if busy work is misaligned with the highest risk scenarios. Monitoring effectiveness means looking for signals that the control changes outcomes, such as a reduction in repeated failures, consistent adherence to access boundaries, improved response speed, or improved recovery reliability. This does not mean you ignore activity measures, because activity can be a leading indicator, but activity alone can hide weak outcomes. Beginners should learn to ask, what does this control exist to accomplish, and what would the world look like if it were succeeding? That question prevents a drift into reporting comfort instead of reporting reality. Evidence is at the heart of monitoring, because evidence is how you avoid guessing about whether a control is operating and whether it is producing outcomes. Evidence can be records of completed actions, but it should also include operational signals that show controls working under normal conditions and under stress. For example, evidence of detection effectiveness includes not only that alerts exist, but that meaningful alerts are handled promptly and lead to appropriate response. Evidence of recovery effectiveness includes not only that restoration was attempted, but that restoration returns services to an acceptable state within a time the organization can tolerate. Evidence of preventive controls includes not only that rules exist, but that risky actions are consistently blocked or require approval, and that exceptions are controlled rather than hidden. The point is to assemble evidence that ties directly to the control objective and that can be reviewed consistently over time. Evidence-based monitoring increases trust because it creates a factual record rather than a set of opinions. Monitoring also needs a rhythm because controls fail in different ways depending on how quickly conditions change. Some controls require frequent monitoring because they protect high-change areas, like systems with rapid release cycles or broad access patterns. Other controls can be monitored less often because the environment is stable and the control is mature, but even stable areas need periodic verification because staff and dependencies still change. A healthy program uses both scheduled monitoring and event-driven monitoring, meaning you reassess when something significant changes, like scope expansion, new integrations, major outages, or shifts in vendor relationships. Beginners should understand that rhythm is part of design, not an afterthought, because a control that is checked too rarely can fail silently for months. At the same time, a control that is monitored too aggressively can create noise and fatigue, which reduces attention where it matters. The goal is a tempo that matches risk and change. Coverage monitoring benefits from strong asset and dependency awareness, because you cannot know what is covered if you do not know what exists and how it is used. If the inventory is incomplete, the organization may report strong compliance, while critical assets remain unmanaged in the background. If ownership is unclear, coverage gaps can persist because no one feels responsible for bringing the asset into standard control processes. If dependencies are poorly understood, coverage can appear adequate on the main system, while key supporting services are outside the control boundary. Monitoring coverage, therefore, includes checking whether critical assets are enrolled, whether newly created assets are included automatically, and whether retirements remove assets cleanly without leaving residual access and data behind. For beginners, this reinforces a simple principle. Coverage is a relationship between controls and scope shifts as organizations grow and change. Coverage monitoring is what keeps the protection map aligned with reality. Once monitoring generates observations, reporting is the step that makes those observations useful to decision-makers, and it succeeds or fails based on clarity. Decision-makers need to know what matters, what changed, and what decisions are required, and they need that information presented in language connected to outcomes. Reporting should explain whether controls are meeting objectives, whether coverage includes what it must include, and whether drift is occurring that could push risk outside tolerance. It should also make it easy to see trends, because trends show whether control health is improving or degrading over time. Beginners sometimes think reports should be exhaustive, but exhaustive reports often cause leaders to ignore them because there is too much detail and not enough meaning. A strong report is selective and deliberate, emphasizing the highest impact controls, the most critical coverage areas, and the most urgent gaps. Reporting is less about volume and more about decision readiness. Good reporting also depends on selecting metrics that map cleanly to control objectives, and that is where beginners can make or break credibility. Metrics should be understandable, stable over time, and resistant to accidental manipulation, meaning they should reflect outcomes rather than superficial activity. A useful metric might track how consistently a control is performed, but it should also show whether the performance leads to reduced exposure or improved response. If you introduce a key performance indicator, KPI, for detection, it should reflect timeliness and quality, not just how many alerts were reviewed, because alert volume can increase while effectiveness decreases. If you introduce a key risk indicator, KRI, for coverage, it might reflect the portion of critical assets outside control scope, because that directly indicates exposure. The best metrics are those that decision-makers can interpret without special translation, because they describe risk movement rather than technical minutiae. Metrics should support decisions, not merely decorate slides. A powerful reporting habit is to pair every metric or observation with an interpretation and an implication, because decision-makers are not served by raw numbers alone. Interpretation explains what the measurement suggests about control health, such as improving stability, degrading coverage, or rising exception activity that threatens operating effectiveness. Implication explains what should happen next, such as maintain and monitor, investigate drift, prioritize a remediation plan, or escalate a decision about risk acceptance. This does not mean the report becomes an opinion piece, because the interpretation is anchored in evidence and tied to control objectives. It simply means the report is not asking decision-makers to do the analysis themselves under time pressure. Beginners should see this as part of professional communication. You provide facts, you explain meaning, and you identify the decision that meaning points toward. Reports that stop at facts often fail because they leave the most important work undone. Control reporting should also make trade-offs visible, because decisions about controls often involve balancing risk reduction against friction, cost, and operational load. A control that is highly protective but routinely bypassed due to workflow conflict is not truly effective, and reporting should surface that tension before it becomes an incident. A control that reduces risk significantly but requires investment should be reported with enough context for leaders to understand what the investment buys and what happens if it is delayed. Reporting should also recognize where simplifying overlap improves both security and operations, because reducing complexity can improve adherence and reduce failure under stress. Beginners sometimes assume leaders only want to hear good news, but leaders usually want to know where risk is rising, where controls are fragile, and where resources are most likely to produce real improvement. Honest reporting builds trust, and trust makes it easier to obtain support when controls genuinely need strengthening. The goal is not comfort, it is informed choice. Another critical element is escalation, which is the mechanism that turns monitoring and reporting into action rather than routine paperwork. Escalation should be triggered by meaningful thresholds, such as control failure in a high-impact area, sustained degradation in a critical KPI, or coverage gaps affecting assets with low tolerance for exposure or downtime. When escalation is clear, teams do not argue about whether to raise an issue, because the rules make the decision predictable. Escalation also prevents quiet normalization of deviance, where repeated small failures become accepted as normal because no one wants to be the person who raises the alarm. For beginners, it is important to understand that escalation is not panic. It is structured response to evidence that risk is drifting. When escalation is linked to control objectives and tolerances, it becomes a disciplined practice rather than a dramatic event. This discipline is how organizations keep control health aligned with risk appetite and operational reality. Monitoring and reporting must also support continuous improvement, because control portfolios should mature over time instead of staying frozen. If monitoring shows a control is effective, the organization can capture what makes it effective, such as clear ownership, training, or good integration into workflows, and replicate that pattern elsewhere. If monitoring shows a control is weak, the organization can decide whether to improve design, strengthen operation, reduce reliance on manual steps, or replace the control with a more reliable approach. Reporting should therefore include not just problems, but also the lessons that will prevent recurrence, because recurrence is often a sign of systemic gaps rather than isolated mistakes. Beginners should recognize that improvement is not only adding new controls. Improvement can also be simplifying existing controls so they are followed consistently. Over time, The best portfolios become smaller and stronger rather than larger and more confusing because evidence reveals which controls truly change outcomes. Continuous improvement is what turns monitoring data into lasting resilience. A final piece that beginners should not overlook is audience tailoring, because decision-makers are not a single group with identical needs. Some leaders need outcome-focused summaries tied to mission impact, while others need enough operational detail to allocate staff and adjust priorities. Reporting should therefore be consistent in structure while adaptable in depth, so the same underlying evidence can produce a leadership view and an operational view without contradiction. The leadership view emphasizes coverage, trends, and decisions required, while the operational view emphasizes ownership, next actions, and verification steps. This is not duplication. It is translation, and translation is part of responsible risk communication. When reports are tailored properly, leaders can act without being overwhelmed, and operators can act without being underinformed. Beginners should see that a report is successful when it changes behavior in the right way, not when it contains the most detail. Reporting is a tool for action, and action is the purpose. To conclude, monitoring and reporting control effectiveness and coverage is how an organization maintains confidence that its safeguards still work and still apply where they need to apply. Monitoring focuses on evidence and outcomes, catching drift in design, operation, and scope before drift becomes harm, while coverage monitoring ensures critical assets and dependencies are not quietly left outside protective boundaries. Reporting translates monitoring observations into decision-ready information using objective-aligned metrics such as KPI and KRI, clear interpretation, and clear implications for action and escalation. Strong reporting makes trade-offs visible, supports continuous improvement, and tailors depth to decision-maker needs without losing consistency or honesty. When these practices are mature, control portfolios become simpler, stronger, and more resilient because the organization learns what works through evidence rather than assumption. If you can explain not only what controls exist, but how well they perform, how broadly they cover, and what decisions the evidence demands, you have built a critical skill for trustworthy risk management.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.